Well, thank you everybody for coming. Good afternoon. I really appreciate you being here. And today is a compliment to our exhibit, Places in Time. We have Andrea Boon. She is a park ranger at Goose Island State Park, which is right up the road, and she's going to be talking about some of the historic aspects of the park, and she's going to show how it is a place in time in Lorenzo County. Thank you again for being here and take it away. Oh, was this off?
Yeah.
Okay.
Alright, don't let me stay up here and do that for sound quality. But thanks everyone for coming to my presentation on the history at Goose Island State Park. So I definitely find, and those of us who work at the park definitely find that Goose Island is a great topic for discussing the history there. We definitely think that we have a historic park with a historic tree filled with great historic conservation efforts. We are a relatively small park on the Lamar Peninsula, just north here of Rockport. This might show up as well on this screen. I'm going to duck in front here. This here is park proper, and even though it's not shaded, this is the actual Goose Island there. That is the park proper area. So that area is about 300 acres in the park proper. It abuts against the St. Charles Bay and the Aransas Bay. The coastal shoreline being made up of the Mission Aransas estuary, where the bay waters meet the fresh waters, and the inland environment is partially coastal prairie, but mostly dominated by the coastal live oak forests that folks are familiar with here. The parkland also includes the Main Street entering the Goose Island, as well as the Palmetto Street heading up to the Big Tree area, and the 78-acre Big Tree natural area that we hope to have available to the public in the form of nature trails soon. In state parks time, soon means probably, hopefully, a couple of years. But that's soon for us. So human use in the area probably goes back thousands of years. For as long as there have been humans using and occupying this general region, there have probably been folks living in and or using the land in the Lamar Peninsula and the area that is now known as Goose Island. And we do have some archaeological evidence within the Goose Island boundaries that there have been people at least using the land, if not living there. None of that archaeological evidence is diagnostic or specifically datable. However, it does tell us that folks were there at some point during human use, through human history in the area. And it makes sense that folks would be there along that coastline in that area for the same reasons that we all enjoy being in this area. The humidity and the mosquitoes, which is what we're all here for. But it's really the birds and mammals that are available there to hunt, fish and shellfish that are available for harvesting in the estuaries, and the oysters along the area for gathering as well. These are things that we still go to the areas for, and it's the reasons that prehistoric and Native Americans were there for as well. We definitely know that there were folks there in the late prehistoric period, which dates from about 750 to 300 before present, otherwise would otherwise be known as about 1250 to 1700 AD. And this would have included the Rockport phase culture that we term that particular culture. Those folks who would have been there at that time, we call it the Rockport phase culture. And the Karankawa are the Native Americans that would have been there when the Europeans arrived, living and moving in this region, who are probably a continuation of the Rockport phase as we entered into the historic time period after the late prehistoric time period. These folks would have lived in a much different landscape in the area than we are familiar with today. Instead of it being dominated by the coastal live oak forests, we would have seen a domination of the coastal prairies environment. The Karankawa would have lived in smaller, more mobile groups, moving around the region, living off of a diverse diet of plants and animals. Those living closer to the coastline having a higher emphasis on the aquatic resources. Around this time, they would have already developed bow and arrow technologies that they would have used to hunt both on land and in the water. They would have also have developed a diverse ceramics types, fired with a sandy paste tempering and decorated with patterns of asphaltum on them. Asphaltum being a naturally occurring tar-like material that is found on beaches, naturally occurring from oil seepages that come up from the Gulf Coast. Unfortunately, the Karankawa as a distinct civilization and culture were lost to us by the mid-1800s. The people and populations decimated by previously unknown to them, diseases brought by Europeans, decimated by conflicts with European groups, conflicts with other Native American groups, and then eventually assimilation into other groups. And this caused the loss of those folks as their own individual culture, the Karankawa. European groups and other settlers from other areas would settle the Lamar Peninsula over the next 200 years. The lands changing hands and families and changing ownership in various ways, but generally remaining homesteads and ranching in the area. Although Goose Island, the land that Goose Island is on, may have been part of land purchased by Samuel Colt that was to become a factory for his famous pistols. Unfortunately, Samuel Colt would die not long after that purchase was made, and the completion of that purchase would be heavily disputed by the descendants for a while afterward. But for several hundred years, the big tree, not yet a big tree, would oversee and look over this history as it unfolded. We used to believe that the big tree, or used to guess that the big tree was about 1,000 years old. At this time, our best guesstimation is that it's probably closer to several hundred years and not quite 1,000. But it is still one of the largest coastal live oaks in the US, and it is still the largest coastal live oak on public property. It stands 44 feet tall, though you may expect a coastal live oak of that age to be a little bit taller. The constant coastal Gulf breezes have kept it a little bit shorter than quite such an old tree would be. Despite that, the crown still reaches 89 feet end to end, and the trunk is 35 feet in circumference around. And it having been there for several centuries, it was there when the last Native Americans were there, and this was possibly an important area and tree to them. It's also rumored to have been a pirate hangout and possibly a hanging tree in its history. In 1923, the Texas State Parks Board would be created. In 1931, the state would have acquired most of the lands that would be considered Goose Island today. The state having owned some of it for some time already. Other private donations would be made in the time. And and since the State Parks Board was created in 1923, the lands that had been donated and the state already owned had already been designated to be preserved and as natural areas. So once the State Parks Board was created, their plans were put into place to make this land into a state park. In 1933, the Civilian Conservation Corps would be created. The CCC was a Depression-era public works program that was put out by FDR's New Deal to help alleviate some of the suffering and the worst of the Great Depression in the 30s. The CCC projects generally focused on natural resource conservation, preservation, recreation, and appreciation of those resources. So all of the shuns for the resources. These projects generally came in the form of creating and maintaining federal forests and creating public parks across the U.S. These would range from national parks all the way down to local parks. They would also focus on soil conservation projects, many of which those efforts would overlap with the creation of forests and parks. The CCC would hire generally young unmarried men between the ages of 16 and 28 years old, as well as war veterans. They would receive wages, educations, and marketable skills. Part of the reason that the CCC focused on that demographic was because during the Great Depression, these were actually statistically the least employed men, or people in general, in the US. As young men, they might not have had the same education and marketable skills or experience as older men of the era, and women could be paid less at that time. That made them more desirable to employers during the Great Depression, and women were still needed generally at home to care for others. But with the CCC being able to not only employ these young men of this demographic, they sent most of their wages home to those men's families. This enabled them to put food on their table, pay their utility bills, and pay for other basic needs during this really hard time. So that tactic allowed the CCC to not only hire, pay, and employ this one demographic, it was able to spread that aid so much further along into different communities in the way that they did that. But the CCC would build 56 state parks in Texas before they finished, 29 of which still remain state parks to this day. Some have become federal parks, some have been transferred to other entities like the Texas Historical Commission, some simply no longer have the status of a state park, but 29 of which are still functioning, visitable state parks today. In 1934, Civilian Conservation Corps Company 1801 arrives and starts building Goose Island State Park. They were one of the handful of mixed-race companies that would serve in Texas. They started clearing land, planting trees, managing the Big Tree area, which to them was known as the Mighty Oak. And I vote we change it back to the Mighty Oak. I like that.
Here, here.
We'll start a petition. They started building the infrastructure that would make Goose Island, as well as creating the shellcrete blocks that they would build up the structures there out of. However, come April of 1935, there would be federal policy changes to the CCC companies. It decreed that there would no longer be mixed-race companies like we had at Goose Island. They would be completely segregated. So Company 1801 is removed from Goose Island, reorganized, and replaced with Company 1801C, the C denoting a colored or all African American company. They would continue the hard work of clearing land, building infrastructure and buildings that 1801 had done before them. Unfortunately, the locals in the area were greatly displeased and unhappy with the presence of 1801C in the area, and their complaints would reach such high-level administrators in conjunction with a possible rumor of an alleged murder that may have been associated with Company 1801C. And this had higher-level administrators removing Company 1801C in June of 1935 to projects in the San Antonio area. But we still have their legacy at Goose Island State Park. Our last remaining CCC building is our rec hall, our recreation hall, known to the CCC as the concessions building in their time. It is a shellcrete building. Shellcrete is a building material, a cement type mixed with crushed oyster shells that was actually a very important industry in the local area in its history. And the CCC preferred to use local materials when they made their buildings. So the rec hall is known for its Shell Creek exterior, but it's also known for its rough hewn timber interior. When you go inside, you will see the rafters and the roof beams and the fireplace made of this rough cut timber, which has this really beautiful aesthetic to it, and it makes a really gorgeous contrast between the dark beams and the white Shell Creek walls. The current whitewash that you will see on the rec hall building today is a more recent addition to it. So the CCC did construct their parks with specific atmospheres and aesthetics in mind. They did want their buildings to blend into the background, into the natural backgrounds, become part of the landscapes as opposed to obstructive or obtrusive things in the way of the landscape, become part of the scenery. And other features that they would build into the park, such as the tree tunnels that you would have found at Goose, most of them are unfortunately lost to us today, created these gorgeous scenic corridors that you would drive through on your approach to Goose Island. So with these features that you find at the park, Goose Island is a cultural landscape in itself. The land being formed specifically with design and intent in mind in its creation. For decades, Goose Island has been enjoyed by the public as it was intended by the CCC for fishing, camping, and birding, and general outdoor recreation use. Creating a general connection to the park. This generational link and the cultural landscape created are arguably make it a historic cultural resource in its own right. Oftentimes we hear Goose referred to as just another RV park in the area amongst so many others. But for these generations, Goose has been reaching out to the public and offering access to the outdoors in birding, fishing, and yes, RV camping, but it's also offering so much more than the CCC had imagined in its time. We offer kayaking programs, geocaching programs, junior ranger bags for the kids to get involved. We host Buffalo Soldier programs, night sky programs, and so many more throughout the years that generationally the public has been enjoying there, and we hope to continue enjoying for many generations to come. But on August 25th, 2017, a historic storm will hit our historic park. On this day, Hurricane Harvey makes landfall. It is 280 miles wide. The winds are 130 miles an hour, tearing at the land. A 12-foot storm surge in some areas washes over not only Goose, but of course the entire area. It is the second most destructive and costly hurricane in Texas history since 1900. Goose Island receives a great deal of damage to our historic and cultural resources. Our structures, buildings, and our infrastructure is greatly damaged. The pier is wiped away. Utilities on the bayfront have to be completely undone and rebuilt. Buildings from the small picnic covered roofs all the way to the bathhouses in the wooded area have to be repaired. 100% of the tree crown leaves is sheared off, and 40% of the trees and limbs are downed or damaged. This would equal the amount of 7.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools of tree debris that had to be removed from the park. This lack of shade and the loss of all of those trees led to an explosive growth of the underbrush and invasive plants, suddenly receiving all of that space and light. That is a continuing and constant battle that park staff are always battling, along with our volunteers and other programs that come in to help us battle this. But as we rebound from historic storms and rebuild our historic structures, as the saying goes, history is happening every day, and Goose is no exception. The opportunities afforded for ecotourism at Goose are opportunities that allow us our efforts in preservation. The use of the estuaries and the bays and their resources by birders and fishing folk and campers help the state parks in our preservation efforts. The use of these resources also spark and encourage that urge to protect and maintain those resources by the folks who are using it for future use for themselves and for the generations that will come after. Goose Island State Park, the land, particularly some of the wetland areas in the park, are areas that are used by the highly endangered but slowly growing flock of whooping cranes that come to feed there. Also, the opportunities that attract all of the fishing folk to Goose Island help us to preserve the game fish in the bays that are around as well. The same goes for the birders. From beginning birders to influential professional birders such as Connie Hagar help us to maintain the environment at Goose for migratory birds that come through, both wetland and wooded birds. It also makes Goose a location, a destination location in the Hummingbird Festival that comes through. Goose Island is also a location for oyster reef restoration. This is the basis of a healthy ecosystem for the entire estuary bay system. A single restoration event at Goose can lay down as much as 23,000 pounds of oyster shell to those reefs. The original landscape mentioned earlier, the coastal prairies, has been almost entirely lost in Texas. Of the original 6.5 million acres of coastal prairie in Texas, only about 1% remains. And Goose has been replanting and maintaining as much coastal prairie in our park as we can. And we are always encouraging other entities, public and private, even private citizens, to help us restore the coastal prairie. Even a backyard can be part of that coastal prairie ecosystem. Every square foot provides environment for all of the creatures that thrive on coastal prairie. So with all of this in mind, I hope that you all also see Goose Island as a historic park with a historic tree and historic conservation. Thanks, guys.
All right, thank you, Andrea. That was really interesting. I really appreciate you being able to speak, and I do have a couple minutes for questions.
Absolutely.
Does anybody have any questions?
I'll let you pick, Dave.
Okay, we'll go front to back.
Yes. Okay, question about Hurricane Harvey. The slide said that 40% of live oak trees were damaged, or how long does it take for a live oak tree to recover from something like that, to grow back?
I do not know.
Okay.
More than 3 to 4 years.
Okay.
I can tell you that much.
Yeah, it's decades.
Yeah, that would be my guess as well.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Where are the oyster reefs from the location of the park?
At least outside of Goose Island, if you are looking out into the waters and you see these small, I want to say 1-inch PVC pipes coming out of the water, those denote where the oyster reefs are, mostly so that, particularly so that boats going around will not hit them and that they can be preserved that
Do
way
they
as
have
well.
little flashing lights on them at night, or is that something?
Not that
else?
I'm aware of.
Yeah, that's something else. Okay.
They could, but I don't know. I just know that the white pipes denote the oyster reefs.
Okay.
Yeah, I have two, one logical and one totally illogical. So a question on the oyster reefs is oyster harvesting prevented there? Do you prohibit?
So, it's not one of our rules, but federally, I know it was an F word, it is, I don't know, I'm guessing it's federal, but it is a felony to collect oysters within, I don't remember the exact distance, but my guess would be about 100 yards off of our shore, not necessarily to protect the oyster reefs and our populations, but because of the runoff that comes from that just comes off of the shores in the entire area, both just general chemical runoff, field runoffs, and other, I don't want to say poisons, but just other all the runoff that you get from civilization and whatnot actually makes oysters within that distance dangerous to eat. And that's why it is a felony, is because those oysters can be dangerous to eat.
Okay.
But yes.
The other question is, I've always been curious about the name. So were there or are there large populations of geese, or did they mistake whooping cranes for geese?
Neither. If I could quickly go back to the screen, but I can't. If you want to find that, it would be the second screen. The island itself, I don't know if we have a zoom function. So the shape used to be a little bit different, but if you use your imagination really hard, it kind of looks like the profile of a goose head. And there has been a lot of erosion over the years, and so this used to be a little more filled out, and it used to look like the profile of a
Thank
goose.
you. I've always wondered about that.
Yeah,
too.
so we get that question a lot. Yes, ma'am.
Question. And you may not have the answer for this, but I've been wanting to collect some oyster shells, maybe from some that are donated to me, from maybe a seafood company. I don't know what they do with them. But I would love to use them and crush them for driveway. Is that something that is allowed this day?
I do not know. I know you can't collect anything from within
I
the
can't
park.
Yeah,
put
you
it
can
in
buy
my driveway.
piles and piles, all you
Yeah.
want.
Can I?
Have you talked to Aldi's?
No,
I think
I
they
haven't.
say, I think they sell those, you know, the big giant
Yes,
mound
yes.
of them, I think they sell them.
And I know they're hard on your tires, but I'm willing to do the work.
Actually, that's not the biggest problem. We used to live on an oyster shell street, and the biggest problem is dust.
Oh, the dust, okay.
Yeah, if you go to that seafood place, they just take all their oysters and throw them in the parking lot every night
Yeah.
when they get done with all the oysters.
I
But
will
yeah,
check with them.
yeah.
And thank you, Ranger Andy, for the geocaching course yesterday. I camped at Goose Island this weekend, and I had a delightful time.
Oh, I'm so
That
glad.
was cute.
You know, it was just as the sun was setting, and I was
Yeah.
cooking my dinner. No, it wasn't that bad. I make my own lavender and rosemary sticks,
Okay,
and I lit one of those, and I was fine.
great.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. I was in the wooded area. I chose that.
Yeah, good deal.
Good to hear.
Andy, on the Samuel Cole's purchase of that property,
Yeah.
I've got the original deed on that purchase, and he paid $20,000 for most of what is Lamar. And
All right then.
But the guys that sold it to him had to exclude part of the coastline because they had already sold that.
Ah.
And they excluded the salt works too because it was in operation. It's a good question about whether Goose Island was included. I don't think it was.
Yeah, it's been long on my to-do list to find the maps and find the deeds and find
Got
which
it. And
plots were involved or not.
Jerry drew the boundaries. It's got the meets and bounds, so that you can interpret that. You can't tell really what he bought, but he bought mostly from the inside, well, what's now Front Street, I guess, where
Yeah.
the Catholic organization is. He didn't sell them that because
Okay.
they had sold property along there. But it goes all the way up, I mean, he bought like 90% of the peninsula.
Oh, wow. I
And
didn't know it was quite so much.
sight unseen, you know, they sent him a map, said, you need to be making guns here because you're selling so many in Texas.
And that's what, that's
He
about
had
as
so
much
much
research
money,
as I've
he
got.
had so much money that he just sent him a check for $20,000 to buy the place.
Sounds fun.
19, what,
Yeah.
I can't remember the date, I'm bad about that.
1970s?
Yes, in 1870. And then his wife was a big, he made a fortune. He was one of the richest guys in the country after he got really going. And his wife was a bit philanthropist, and she gave money to everybody. And so I'm pretty sure what happened was she said, why do we have this piece of land in Texas? And she gave it back to the guys and sold it to them. And so that's, but what was in dispute all the time was exactly what the boundaries were. Yeah. So there's still people that have titles in question, I think, over there.
I tried to read some of the legal documentation, and it seemed to go on for decades because it was the heir of the heir of the heir of so-and-so of the descendant. Oh,
Yeah,
this
and
is
part
dragging
of the
out.
problem was, you know, there was 2 or 3 guys involved in the sale.
Yeah.
And their heirs were part of the problem. Because when they get it back, they have, it's kind of, I think, a mystery who has the title, why, you know, fascinating story.
It was, but it was really
And
hard.
they've told the story in Rockport forever
Yeah.
that he was here and established a factory and was making 6 guns on one,
Oh,
which he never did.
Yeah.
oh.
But he thought it was a good idea, so he just blocked.
Might have been a good idea.
Plus, he did have a lot of sales in Texas.
So is the pier built back, fishing pier that goes
Yes,
out far?
everything on the bay has been rebuilt, all of the infrastructure redone, the pier completely rebuilt. We were able to use the same pilings, however, it no longer has the hump, so it is flat and completely accessible, all 1,627 feet.
All right.
Wow, nice.
My question, you mentioned the different programs that you have going on out there at different times. How would a person avail themselves of that information?
You can always give us a call during business hours. We're there every day, every holiday, barring when massive storms come through. Our social media pages are one of the best ways to find out our programs. At the beginning of the month, we post our monthly schedule of our programs. We're also always, you can always message us and we can get back to you with any questions. that
So
you have
that's
there.
on Facebook?
Facebook and Instagram are the fastest ways to reach park staff directly,
Thank you.
besides calling us.
And they should all be on the calendar of events too for the website.
Yeah.
So if you go onto our website, you can look on whichever state park and it'll have a calendar of events on it.
I appreciate
The
that.
main TPWD website, each park has its own section there, and yeah, we do have the calendar of events. Anybody else? And so that goes for folks who are watching us later. Social media, you can send us messages and we will get back to you as soon as we can. And you can reach us there as well if you have any other questions about this presentation.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all for coming.